The dawn of a bizarre disease. For over 300 years, European doctors had a name for what happened to teenage girls: the disease of virgins. Pale skin with a greenish tint, strange food cravings for chalk and clay, weakness that wouldn't go away. The cure? Get married immediately, have sex, get pregnant. If marriage wasn't possible, doctors recommended vigorous horseback riding to simulate, well, you can guess what. This disease struck millions of young women. Then in the 1920s, it simply vanished. Tonight, you'll learn why. Welcome to Hearts and History. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe grab that extra pillow. We're diving into one of history's strangest medical mysteries together. If this kind of content helps you unwind, hit subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this community spans the globe. Ready? Let's go back to 1554 and meet a girl named Anna. Anna is losing her glow. That's how German physician Johannes Langer describes it in his medical notes. This teenage girl, once vibrant and rosy, is now pale, almost green around the edges. She's tired all the time, won't eat proper food but craves bizarre things like starch and dirt. Her parents are panicked because here's the thing, Anna's getting less attractive by the day. And in 1554, a girl's marriageability is literally her life insurance. Langer has seen this before. He calls it chlorosis, the green sickness. Lange isn't making this up. He's drawing from ancient Greek medical wisdom, the Hippocratic tradition that's guided doctors for over 1,000 years. The logic seems airtight to him. Young women's bodies are designed for one purpose: reproduction. Puberty fires up all these internal systems, creating heat and fluids that need somewhere to go. Menstruation helps, but it's not enough. Without regular sex and pregnancy, all those reproductive juices just back up, stagnate, turn the blood pale and greenish. Makes perfect sense, right? Well, to them it did. The symptoms were maddeningly vague: pale skin, fatigue, loss of appetite, strange cravings for non-food items like chalk or clay, irregular heartbeat, breathlessness, general weakness and moodiness. Sound familiar? To us, this screams iron deficiency anemia, something we'd expect in teenage girls who menstruate and don't eat enough iron-rich foods. But 16th century doctors saw something entirely different. They saw a female body malfunctioning because it wasn't being used for its intended purpose. Marriage wasn't just social, it was medical treatment. Here's where it gets really interesting. The diagnosis was incredibly elastic. Any girl who seemed listless, green sickness, moody teenager who didn't want to marry the guy her parents picked, definitely green sickness. Girl more interested in books than babies. Classic symptoms right there. The vagueness wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It meant virtually any adolescent girl who wasn't performing enthusiastic femininity could be labelled sick, and the cure was always the same: husband, sex, pregnancy. Problem solved, according to the medical establishment. But what if marriage wasn't an option? Doctors got creative with their treatments. Horseback riding was big. The rhythmic motion supposedly mimicked the beneficial effects of intercourse. Warm baths, vaginal fumigations with fragrant herbs, devices called pessaries inserted into the vagina to stimulate the womb. Some physicians even recommended manual genital stimulation by midwives to relieve the sexual congestion. All perfectly medical, they insisted. Not sexual, therapeutic. The goal was health, not pleasure. Sure, guys, sure. Nuns created a fascinating problem for this theory. Here were women committed to lifelong virginity, yet many remained perfectly healthy. Some doctors claimed divine grace protected truly pious women from green sickness. Others recommended nuns engage in vigorous exercise, cold baths, and strict diets to channel their bodily energies away from reproduction. But the fact that countless nuns lived full, healthy lives without ever having sex didn't seem to shake anyone's faith in the theory. Funny how that works when you really want to believe something. By the 1800s, green sickness had become epidemic. Hospital records show it was one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions in young women. But here's the weird part. It mostly struck middle and upper class girls, the ones kept indoors, corseted tight, fed delicate diets, and discouraged from exercise. Working class girls who did physical labour and ate heartier food, rarely diagnosed. The disease seemed to prefer the pale, fragile, ladylike ideal, almost like the symptoms and the beauty standard were the same thing. Coincidence? I think not. Victorian treatments often made things worse. Doctors prescribed rest when exercise would have helped, restrictive diets when better nutrition was needed, continued tight corseting despite breathing problems. The emphasis on marriage as the ultimate cure meant young women were pressured into unions that might not serve their actual well-being. The medical establishment had created the perfect system: identify a problem that conveniently aligned with social expectations, then offer a solution that reinforced existing power structures. Brilliant if you're into that sort of manipulation. Then something remarkable happened. The disease that had supposedly plagued women for 4 centuries just disappeared. By the 1920s, doctors stopped diagnosing green sickness entirely. Better nutrition, looser clothing, more outdoor activity, and changing social expectations about women all played a role. But mostly society stopped pathologizing female adolescence itself. The years between puberty and marriage were no longer seen as a medical emergency. Amazing what happens when you stop treating normal human development like a disease that requires male intervention to cure. The marriage cure. Here's where this gets really wild. You've got these teenage girls, pale and tired, diagnosed with green sickness. And every single medical textbook from 1550 to 1900 prescribed the exact same treatment. Marriage. Not just any marriage, immediate marriage. Followed quickly by pregnancy. Because apparently, unmarried wombs were basically ticking time bombs. The medical establishment had convinced itself that female bodies were so fundamentally designed for reproduction that virginity past 16 was literally toxic. Amazing how convenient that was for patriarchal society, right? Think about what this meant for families. Your daughter's looking a little pale, a bit moody, maybe she's been reading too much instead of embroidering. Boom, green sickness. And suddenly you've got medical authority telling you that delaying her marriage isn't just socially irresponsible, it's dangerous to her health. Doctors literally wrote that unmarried girls were risking their lives by remaining virgins. Parents who might have let their daughters mature naturally were now being told that waiting could cause permanent damage. Medical emergency beats personal preference every time. The medical texts were incredibly specific about this. Johannes Langer, who first described the condition in 1554, wrote that young women's bodies produced excess heat and fluids during puberty. These needed to be released through menstruation, but menstruation alone wasn't enough. The female system required regular intercourse and pregnancy to function properly. Without these outlets, the fluids would stagnate, causing the blood to turn pale and greenish. The logic was airtight if you ignored actual human biology. But hey, it sounded scientific enough to convince everyone. What's fascinating is how this created a perfect feedback loop. Girl shows symptoms of what we'd now recognize as iron deficiency anemia or teenage moodiness. Parents get scared because doctors say she's sick. They arrange a hasty marriage to cure her. Once she's married and pregnant, her diet improves, she gets iron from prenatal care, and surprise, she feels better. The cure worked. This convinced everyone that marriage was indeed the solution, when really it was just better nutrition and the end of tight corseting that helped. But here's what really gets me. The symptoms were so vague that virtually any girl who wasn't performing enthusiastic femininity could be diagnosed. Doesn't want to marry that guy your father picked. Green sickness. Prefers books to needlework. Green sickness. Seems sad or anxious, like most teenagers. Definitely green sickness. The diagnosis became this incredibly elastic tool that could be applied to any girl who wasn't following the script perfectly. It pathologized normal adolescent behavior and turned resistance to marriage arrangements into a medical condition requiring immediate treatment. The treatments for unmarried girls who couldn't be immediately married were, let's call them, creative. Physicians recommended vigorous horseback riding because the rhythmic motion supposedly mimicked intercourse. They prescribed warm baths, vaginal fumigations with herbs, and pessaries inserted into the vagina to stimulate the dormant womb. Some doctors even recommended manual genital stimulation by midwives to relieve the congestion caused by unfulfilled desire. All of this was justified as medical therapy, not sexual activity, because the goal was health restoration. The mental gymnastics are incredible. Nuns presented this amazing contradiction to the whole theory. Here you had women committed to lifelong virginity who remained perfectly healthy. Some physicians argued that divine grace compensated for the lack of sexual activity in truly pious women. Others recommended cold baths, strict diets, and vigorous physical activity to channel bodily energies away from reproduction. The fact that countless nuns lived long, healthy lives without marriage or children should have destroyed the theory completely. Instead, doctors just created special exceptions. When your theory doesn't fit reality, adjust reality, right? By the 1800s, green sickness had become epidemic among middle and upper-class girls. Hospital records show it accounting for massive percentages of female admissions. But here's the kicker. Working-class girls who did physical labour and ate heartier food rarely got diagnosed with it, despite being more vulnerable to actual health problems. The disease seemed to strike precisely the girls who were kept indoors, corseted tightly, fed delicate diets, and expected to be pale and fragile. It was literally a disease of feminine ideals. The very qualities that made you a proper lady also made you sick. The class dimension reveals so much about this supposed disease. Wealthy girls were encouraged to be pale, delicate, and inactive, then diagnosed as sick when they became pale, delicate, and weak. Their pallor was both fashion and symptom. Meanwhile, poor girls who worked in factories, walked everywhere, and ate whatever they could get stayed healthy, but weren't considered proper feminine specimens. The medical establishment had created a perfect catch-22. Follow feminine ideals and risk your health, or be healthy and risk your respectability. Either way, marriage was presented as the solution. Victorian treatments often made everything worse. Doctors prescribed bed rest when exercise would have helped. They recommended restrictive diets when better nutrition was needed. Tight corseting continued despite causing breathing problems. The emphasis on marriage as the ultimate cure meant young women were pressured into unions that might not serve their actual well-being. Meanwhile, the real issues, poor nutrition, lack of exercise, restrictive clothing, social isolation, went unaddressed because treating those wouldn't have served the social function of getting girls married off quickly. And then it just vanished. By the 1920s, doctors stopped diagnosing green sickness entirely. A condition that had supposedly plagued millions of women for 4 centuries simply evaporated from medical literature. Better nutrition reduced actual anemia. Fashion changes meant looser clothing and more activity. Most importantly, delayed marriage stopped being pathologized. When society no longer needed a disease to pressure girls into early marriage, the disease ceased to exist. It's one of history's clearest examples of how medical categories serve social purposes, then disappear when those purposes change. The diagnostic tools of societal control. Here's the brilliant thing about chlorosis. The symptoms were completely perfect for what doctors needed. Pallor? Check. Fatigue? Obviously. Loss of appetite, irregular heartbeat, breathlessness, general weakness, all there. But here's what made this diagnosis so powerful. These symptoms could describe basically anything. Iron deficiency, depression, normal teenage moodiness, Even just being tired from wearing a corset all day. The vagueness wasn't a bug in the system, it was the entire feature. Think about it from a control perspective. If you want to medicalize something, you need symptoms that are common enough to apply broadly, but specific enough to sound medical. These chlorosis symptoms hit that sweet spot perfectly. Every teenage girl has felt tired, moody, or pale at some point. But when doctors listed them together with fancy medical language, suddenly normal adolescence became a diagnosable condition requiring immediate intervention. Genius, if you're trying to control people's behavior, the way doctors interpreted these symptoms tells you everything about their real agenda. Girl seems tired. Obviously her unmarried state is causing blood stagnation, loss of appetite. Her womb is languishing without proper stimulation. Irregular heartbeat, the natural result of unfulfilled sexual function. Every single symptom got traced back to the same root cause, virginity, and every symptom pointed to the same cure, marriage and pregnancy. It's almost like they started with the solution and worked backwards. The diagnosis was incredibly elastic. You could stretch it to fit almost any girl who wasn't enthusiastically embracing her expected role. Too interested in books? Chlorosis was affecting her priorities. Seemed sad or anxious? Classic green sickness symptoms. Didn't want to marry the chosen suitor? Her disease state was obviously impairing her judgment. The vague symptoms meant doctors could basically diagnose any girl whose behavior concerned her family. It was a medical catch-all for inconvenient female autonomy. Here's what's fascinating. The girls who got diagnosed were overwhelmingly from wealthy families. Middle and upper class girls who were kept indoors, corseted tight, fed delicate diets. Working class girls who did physical labor and ate heartier food. Rarely diagnosed despite being more vulnerable to actual health problems. This wasn't about medical need. It was about enforcing class-specific ideals of femininity. The pale, weak, protected girl was both the ideal and the patient. Her fragility was the point. The class dimension reveals everything. Poor girls were expected to be strong and work hard. Rich girls were expected to be delicate and need protection. When wealthy girls showed signs of strength or independence, that became pathological. Their energy needed to be redirected toward marriage and motherhood. Meanwhile, working class girls with the same symptoms were just told to work harder. The disease only existed for girls whose families could afford to worry about their marriageability instead of their survival. Any form of resistance became a symptom. Girl doesn't want to marry. Her judgment is impaired by disease. Shows too much interest in learning. The illness is affecting her natural feminine instincts. Seems moody or withdrawn. Textbook chlorosis behavior. The diagnosis created a perfect trap. Normal teenage emotions became proof of pathology. Resistance to social expectations became evidence of medical need. There was literally no way for a girl to argue against the diagnosis without proving she needed treatment. The medical logic was circular, but convincing to people who wanted to believe it. Unmarried girls get sick because their bodies need marriage. Sick girls need to marry quickly before the condition worsens. Any girl who resists marriage must already be affected by the sickness that marriage cures. It's a closed system where the diagnosis justifies the treatment, and the treatment validates the diagnosis. Parents got medical authority backing up their social preferences. Brilliant manipulation disguised as healthcare. What made this system so effective was how it aligned medical authority with family interests. Parents who might have felt guilty pressuring daughters into early marriage now had doctor's orders. Girls who might have resisted family pressure now faced medical evidence of their need for treatment. The diagnosis transformed a social conflict into a medical emergency. It wasn't about control anymore, it was about care. About saving these poor sick girls from their own diseased reluctance to embrace their natural destiny. The diagnosis also silenced dissent by pathologizing the dissenter. You can't argue with someone whose judgment is impaired by illness. Any girl who said, "I'm not sick, I just don't want to marry," was displaying classic symptoms of denial. Her resistance proved she needed intervention. Her clear thinking about her own preferences became evidence of unclear thinking caused by disease. The more reasonable her objections, the more obvious her need for treatment. It's psychological warfare dressed up as medicine. This diagnostic framework set up everything that came next. The treatments that ranged from bizarre to invasive. Once you've established that unmarried girls are inherently sick, you can justify almost anything as therapeutic intervention. Horseback riding to simulate intercourse, manual stimulation by midwives, vaginal pessaries and fumigations. All of it becomes medical care instead of what it actually was, systematic control of female sexuality disguised as healthcare. The symptoms were just the beginning. The real damage came from the cure. Alternative stimulating therapies. So what happened when marriage wasn't an option? When parents couldn't find a suitable husband, or when a girl flat out refused to marry? Well, the medical establishment got creative. And by creative, I mean deeply uncomfortable. Physicians developed an entire arsenal of treatments designed to simulate the effects of marriage. These weren't gentle remedies, these were invasive, often humiliating procedures that reveal just how obsessed doctors were with controlling women's bodies. The treatments they prescribed tell us everything about their real motivations. The most popular alternative treatment: horseback riding. Seriously, doctors prescribed vigorous horseback riding because they believed the rhythmic bouncing motion would mimic the beneficial effects of intercourse. Medical texts were explicit about this. The horse's movement would stimulate the reproductive organs and get those stagnant fluids flowing again. Some physicians recommended side saddle riding, others insisted on straddling the horse directly. They even specified how long and how vigorously these rides should be. It sounds absurd now, but thousands of young women were literally prescribed horse therapy. Then there were the vaginal fumigations. Picture this. Physicians would have women squat over pots of boiling water infused with fragrant herbs. Lavender, rosemary, chamomile, sometimes more exotic spices. The steam was supposed to penetrate the vagina and stimulate the womb directly. These fumigation sessions could last hours. Women would sit there, breathing in these herbal vapors, while doctors insisted this was treating their green sickness. The herbs weren't chosen randomly either. Each one supposedly had specific properties to awaken sluggish reproductive organs. Pessaries were another favorite treatment. These were objects inserted directly into the vagina, sometimes for days at a time. They came in different shapes and materials: ivory, wood, even gold for wealthy patients. Some were soaked in herbal tinctures or oils. The idea was that direct contact with the cervix would stimulate the womb into proper function. Women had to keep these things inside them while going about their daily lives. Imagine trying to explain that discomfort to your family when you couldn't even discuss what was happening to you. Bloodletting was prescribed specifically for unmarried women showing signs of green sickness. But not just any bloodletting. Doctors recommended drawing blood from areas close to the reproductive organs: inner thighs, lower abdomen, sometimes even from the vaginal area itself. The theory was that removing excess blood would relieve the congestion causing the greenish pallor. Some physicians advocated for leeches placed directly on the genital area. Yeah, they really believed this would cure what was essentially a young woman's reluctance to marry quickly enough. Enemas were another go-to treatment. Not regular enemas, special herbal concoctions designed to stimulate the reproductive system from the inside. Chamomile enemas, wine enemas, even enemas containing crushed pearls for wealthy patients. The liquid would be held inside for extended periods while the patient lay in specific positions. Doctors claimed this would clear blockages and restore proper flow to the womb. The whole process was invasive, uncomfortable, and had to be repeated regularly. But hey, anything to avoid the real problem, which was forcing teenage girls into unwanted marriages. Here's where things get really uncomfortable. Some physicians actually recommended manual genital stimulation by midwives. They called it medical massage or pelvic treatment. The idea was that skilled midwives could manually stimulate the patient until she reached, well, what we'd now call climax. Doctors genuinely believed this would relieve the buildup of reproductive fluids. They wrote about it in medical journals like it was any other procedure. The fact that this was essentially prescribed intimate contact didn't seem to bother them. It was medicine, not pleasure. What's fascinating is how these treatments varied by social class. Wealthy women got gold pessaries, pearl enemas, and private consultations with expensive physicians. Poor women got rougher treatments, coarser materials, harsher procedures, less gentle handling. Working class girls were often told to do more physical labour instead of receiving elaborate therapies. The disease supposedly affected all unmarried women equally, but the cures definitely reflected your family's bank account. Rich girls got pampered into submission. Poor girls got worked into it. Nuns presented a special challenge because permanent virginity was supposed to be holy. Some doctors argued that divine grace would protect truly pious women from green sickness. Others weren't so sure. Convents developed their own treatments: extra fasting, cold baths, vigorous physical work, sometimes bloodletting during certain seasons. A few progressive physicians quietly suggested that some nuns might benefit from the same manual treatments as other unmarried women. But this was controversial. How do you treat a disease caused by virginity when virginity is supposed to be sacred? The sexual nature of these treatments wasn't accidental. Every single one was designed to stimulate, penetrate, or somehow activate the female reproductive system. Horse riding mimicked intercourse. Pessaries penetrated like a penis. Manual stimulation provided the release that marriage supposedly offered. Even the fumigations were about opening and warming the vaginal area. These weren't neutral medical procedures. They were explicitly sexual interventions designed to substitute for what doctors really wanted, which was for every teenage girl to get married and pregnant as quickly as possible. What's most revealing is how these treatments reflect the medical establishment's true beliefs about women. They genuinely thought female bodies were incomplete without male sexual contact. Every alternative therapy was trying to replicate marriage and pregnancy artificially. The fact that many of these treatments were invasive, uncomfortable, or downright humiliating didn't matter. Women's comfort was secondary to correcting their unmarried state. The disease wasn't really green sickness. The disease, in their minds, was female independence, and every treatment was designed to cure that particular problem. An enigma of the Victorian era. By the 1850s, something strange was happening in drawing rooms across England. Green sickness wasn't just affecting a few unfortunate girls anymore. It was everywhere. Hospital records show chlorosis accounting for up to 16% of female admissions. 16%. Think about that for a second. 1 in 6 young women seeking medical care were supposedly suffering from this mysterious virgin disease. Victorian doctors weren't alarmed by these numbers. They were fascinated. Finally, they thought, we're properly identifying this ancient female affliction. The diagnosis had become so common that medical textbooks treated it like catching a cold. Expected, normal, inevitable, even. Young ladies in their teens and early 20s were dropping like flies, but in the most genteel way possible. Pale, listless, sighing dramatically on fainting couches. Their mothers nodded knowingly. Oh yes, the green sickness. Poor dear. Physicians sharpened their pens to write yet another chlorosis diagnosis. It was almost fashionable to be mysteriously, romantically unwell, almost like the disease had become part of being a proper Victorian girl. But here's where it gets interesting. Doctors weren't just diagnosing chlorosis anymore. They were explaining it. And their explanations. Pure victim blaming wrapped in medical authority. Take fresh air, for instance. Victorian physicians insisted that young ladies spent too much time indoors. All that drawing room sitting, they claimed, was literally making girls sick. The cure? More outdoor exposure. But wait, these same doctors also insisted that ladies shouldn't be out unaccompanied, shouldn't engage in vigorous activity, shouldn't be anywhere unsupervised. So the lack of fresh air was somehow the girls' fault. Then there were the dietary lectures. Oh, the dietary lectures. Victorian doctors blamed chlorosis on inadequate nutrition, claiming young ladies ate like birds, too delicate, too refined, not enough hearty food. But here's the thing, these same medical experts also insisted that proper ladies should have small appetites. Eating with enthusiasm was unladylike. Large meals were vulgar, so girls were criticised for eating too little, while being taught that eating too much was improper. The medical establishment had created a no-win situation and then blamed the victims for losing. And the corsets? Oh, the corsets got blamed too. Doctors wrote lengthy papers about how tight lacing restricted breathing, compressed organs, and contributed to the pale, breathless symptoms of chlorosis. They were absolutely right about the health dangers. But guess who was enforcing corset wearing? The same society producing these medical opinions. Mothers laced their daughters tighter each morning. Fashion magazines promoted impossibly tiny waists. Social expectations demanded the corseted silhouette. Then doctors pointed at struggling, breathless girls and said, well, if you didn't wear such tight corsets, as if 16-year-olds were making these choices independently. What's really happening here is Victorian society's anxieties being channeled through medical diagnoses. The ideal Victorian woman was supposed to be pure, delicate, and dependent, but this ideal was literally making women sick. So instead of questioning the ideal, they medicalized the sickness, made it the women's fault. Not enough fresh air, personal failing, poor diet, individual choice, tight corseting, vanity problem. The social system creating these issues remained unquestioned, while the victims got diagnosed, lectured, and blamed for their own suffering. The class dynamics make this even more revealing. Middle and upper class girls were drowning in chlorosis diagnoses, but working class girls, mysteriously immune. Servants, factory workers, farm girls, they weren't getting green sickness. Why? Well, they were getting plenty of fresh air through manual labour. Their diets might have been simple, but they were substantial. They couldn't afford tight corseting. They were living the lifestyle doctors claimed would prevent chlorosis. Yet somehow, the medical literature barely mentioned this striking pattern. Poor girls doing physical work weren't getting sick, but that didn't fit the narrative. Instead, Victorian medicine doubled down on victim blaming. They claimed working class girls were naturally hardier, more robust, less refined, the implication being that chlorosis was somehow a mark of superior breeding. Only the most delicate, well-born ladies were susceptible to this romantic malady. It was almost a status symbol. Your daughter has chlorosis. How refined, how sensitive, how perfectly tragically feminine. The disease became a way to reinforce class distinctions while medicalizing the problems that class privilege was creating. Brilliant social engineering disguised as medical science. Victorian doctors were essentially creating a medical justification for social control. The perfect woman was pale, weak, and dependent. But if she got too pale, too weak, too dependent, then she was sick and needed treatment. The treatment? Become a perfect woman through marriage and motherhood. Can't get married yet? Then suffer gracefully while we blame your lifestyle choices. The medical establishment had created a closed loop. Society makes you sick. Medicine blames you for being sick. Cure requires conforming to the same society that made you sick. This is why working class girls weren't getting diagnosed. They weren't living the lifestyle that created the problem, so they weren't developing the symptoms. But more importantly, they weren't valuable enough to medicalize. Poor girls who seemed tired or pale were just tired and pale. Rich girls with the same symptoms got medical attention. lengthy diagnoses and expensive treatments. Chlorosis was a luxury disease for luxury people, with luxury explanations that avoided questioning luxury lifestyles. The girls who most needed medical care were ignored while privileged girls got pathologized. By the height of the Victorian era, chlorosis had become a perfect mirror of societal contradictions. Women were told to be delicate, but blamed for being fragile, expected to be pure, but pathologized for remaining unmarried, required to be fashionable, but criticized for fashion's health consequences. The disease wasn't just diagnosing medical symptoms, it was diagnosing the impossible position Victorian society had created for young women. And then, instead of fixing the position, medicine made it the women's fault for struggling within it. Tomorrow, we'll see how this medical house of cards finally collapsed. The social dimensions of chlorosis. Here's what gets weird about green sickness. It was incredibly picky about who it attacked. Not picky about age or geography. Picky about social class. The disease that supposedly plagued millions of young women. It had a very specific type. Upper-class girls, pale and delicate, confined to drawing rooms and tight corseting. They dropped like flies. Working-class girls, hauling water and scrubbing floors 12 hours a day, mysteriously immune. This wasn't coincidence. This was society literally making some women sick while keeping others healthy. Think about this for a second. You're a physician in 1880s London. Two 16-year-old girls walk into your office. One is the daughter of a banker, pale skin, fashionably thin, complains of fatigue and strange cravings. Classic chlorosis case. The other is a factory worker's daughter, rosy cheeks, strong arms, same age, probably has actual anemia from poor nutrition, but she's not getting diagnosed with green sickness. Why? Because her lifestyle didn't fit the narrative. Chlorosis required a very specific kind of femininity to flourish. The Victorian feminine ideal was basically designed to produce chlorosis symptoms. Think about it. Wealthy families kept their daughters indoors to protect their complexions. Pale skin was beautiful. Rosy cheeks meant you worked outside like a commoner. They fed girls tiny portions to maintain fashionable figures. They laced them into corsets so tight they could barely breathe. Then they wondered why these girls seemed weak and listless. It wasn't mysterious illness. It was the natural result of treating young women like exotic greenhouse flowers. Meanwhile, working-class girls were living completely different lives. They walked miles every day. They ate whatever they could get: bread, potatoes, occasional meat, hearty food even if there wasn't enough of it. No corseting because they couldn't afford fancy clothes. No protection from sunlight because they worked in fields or factories. These girls developed actual health problems, industrial injuries, malnutrition, respiratory diseases from factory fumes. But green sickness? Almost never. Their lifestyles accidentally protected them from the fashionable disease of feminine fragility. Doctors noticed this pattern, but drew exactly the wrong conclusions. Instead of thinking, maybe the problem is keeping girls locked up indoors with terrible diets, they decided working-class girls were naturally hardier, more robust, less delicate. The implication was clear: true femininity required fragility. If you were strong enough to work, you weren't feminine enough to get the fashionable diseases of proper ladies. This turned chlorosis into a kind of status symbol. Only the most refined girls were delicate enough to suffer from it. Fashion magazines actually promoted the chlorosis look. Pale, ethereal, slightly otherworldly, like you might faint at any moment. This was peak attractiveness. Girls used lemon juice and vinegar to make their skin paler. They avoided exercise that might give them healthy colour. Some actually tried to cultivate the symptoms: the interesting pallor, the romantic weakness, the mysterious cravings. Being diagnosed with green sickness proved you were properly feminine. It meant you were too refined for the coarse realities of physical labour or robust health. Medical bias played a huge role in who got diagnosed. Doctors were typically upper-class men treating upper-class families. They understood the lifestyle and expectations of wealthy girls. When a banker's daughter complained of fatigue, doctors took it seriously. When a servant girl complained of fatigue, well, that was probably just laziness. Poor girls were expected to be tired. Rich girls weren't supposed to be. Same symptoms, completely different interpretations, based on social class expectations. The disease existed partly because doctors expected to find it in certain types of patients. Here's the control aspect. Chlorosis diagnosis gave families medical justification for decisions they wanted to make anyway. Parents worried their daughter was too independent, too interested in books instead of marriage. Chlorosis explained everything. She wasn't strong-willed, she was sick. She needed protection, supervision, early marriage to cure her condition. The diagnosis transformed normal teenage behavior, questioning authority, wanting some independence, into symptoms of a disease that required more parental control, not less. Pretty convenient for everyone except the girls. The contradiction was glaring, but nobody wanted to see it. The healthiest young women in society, those doing physical labor, eating whatever food they could get, wearing practical clothes, never got green sickness. The most pampered, protected, carefully tended girls, they were dropping like flies from mysterious feminine illness. Any rational observer would conclude that pampering was the problem, not the solution. But admitting that would mean admitting that upper-class lifestyle choices were actively harmful to young women's health. Much easier to call it a mysterious disease. What this reveals is how societies create diseases to justify their prejudices. Chlorosis wasn't really about medicine, it was about maintaining class boundaries and gender roles. The pale, weak, dependent girl became the ideal precisely because her helplessness required male protection and family supervision. Her illness proved she needed taking care of. Working-class girls, denied this luxury of fragility, were implicitly less feminine, less worthy of protection. The disease that supposedly plagued all young women actually reflected which young women society valued and which it ignored. The shift from the victimization of women. By 1900, something interesting started happening. Young women were staying in school longer, marriage ages crept upward, and suddenly fewer girls were being diagnosed with green sickness. Not because they were getting married faster, but because society was slowly accepting that maybe, just maybe, teenage girls didn't need to rush to the altar to stay healthy. The change wasn't dramatic at first, but cracks were forming in 400 years of medical certainty. The bicycle revolution played a bigger role than you'd expect. Starting in the 1890s, young women were suddenly cycling everywhere, getting fresh air, building actual muscle tone. Their pallor disappeared not because they found husbands, but because they found exercise. Doctors couldn't ignore this. Girls who would have been chlorosis cases in 1850 were now rosy-cheeked and energetic in 1905. Same age, same unmarried status, completely different health outcomes. Then came the nutrition breakthroughs. Scientists started understanding vitamins, iron deficiency, the actual mechanics of anemia. When doctors could measure hemoglobin levels instead of just guessing about stagnant blood, things changed fast. That pale, tired girl wasn't suffering from unfulfilled reproductive destiny. She needed iron supplements and a better diet. The mystical became mundane, the sexual became scientific. Green sickness was losing its grip. Fashion helped kill the diagnosis too. Those crushing corsets that made breathing impossible, going out of style. Floor-length skirts that prevented any real movement, getting shorter. Women's clothing in the 1910s and 20s allowed for actual human function. Suddenly girls weren't breathless and weak from their wardrobes. The symptoms doctors had attributed to sexual frustration disappeared when women could actually breathe and move freely. World War I changed everything. Women took factory jobs, farm work, nursing positions. They proved they could handle physical labor, make their own money, support themselves. A generation of young women demonstrated that unmarried didn't mean helpless or sickly. When society needed female strength and independence, the idea that single women were inherently fragile became inconvenient. Medical theories adjusted to match social needs. The suffrage movement mattered too. Women fighting for the vote weren't performing the pale, weak feminine ideal that Chlorosis represented. They were organizing, speaking publicly, demanding rights. Hard to argue that political activism was a symptom of reproductive dysfunction when these women were clearly thinking and functioning at the highest levels. The disease narrative couldn't compete with the evidence of female capability. The lifestyle differences were stark. Upper-class girls spent their days in drawing rooms, doing needlework, maybe playing piano. Light meals, little protein, lots of tea and cakes. Tight clothing that restricted breathing and circulation. Limited physical activity, because sweat was unladylike. Working-class girls were hauling buckets, kneading bread, walking everywhere, because they couldn't afford carriages. Their bodies were actually functioning the way human bodies are supposed to function. Regular exercise, practical clothing, physical work that built strength rather than cultivated weakness. Medical schools started admitting women in meaningful numbers. Female doctors weren't buying the Chlorosis diagnosis the same way male doctors had. They'd experienced adolescence themselves without requiring marriage as treatment. They understood female bodies from the inside, not as mysterious reproductive vessels that needed male intervention to function properly. Professional medical women questioned assumptions that male physicians had taken for granted. By the 1920s, delayed marriage became socially acceptable, even fashionable. The flapper ideal celebrated young, single women having fun before settling down. When being 22 and unmarried shifted from shameful to stylish, the medical urgency around Chlorosis evaporated. You can't diagnose extended singlehood as pathological when society celebrates it. The disease lost its cultural purpose. Hospital records tell the story perfectly. In 1900, Chlorosis cases filled wards. By 1925, the diagnosis had virtually disappeared from medical charts. Same hospitals, same patient populations, same age groups. But doctors weren't seeing green sickness anymore because they weren't looking for it. The interpretive framework had shifted. Tired teenage girls got iron pills, not marriage prescriptions. The final nail in Chlorosis's coffin was scientific medicine itself. Laboratory tests, controlled studies, statistical analysis, all these tools revealed that the disease had never been consistent or coherent. When medicine became more rigorous, socially constructed diagnoses couldn't survive. Green sickness joined other historical medical mistakes in the dustbin. Progress sometimes means admitting you were completely wrong. Here's what's remarkable. A condition that supposedly affected millions of women for 4 centuries vanished in about a decade. Not because scientists found a cure, but because society stopped needing the diagnosis. When female adolescence became normal instead of dangerous, medicine stopped pathologizing it. Diseases aren't just biological facts. They're stories we tell about bodies, symptoms, and what counts as normal. Deconstructing the disease's vanishing act. Here's what gets me about Chlorosis. After centuries of supposedly affecting millions of women, it just disappeared. Gone. Not gradually reduced or better understood. Completely vanished from medical practice by the 1920s. One day, doctors were diagnosing teenage girls with the disease of virgins, prescribing marriage as cure. The next day, they weren't. The condition that had filled hospital wards and medical textbooks simply stopped existing. What happened? The answer reveals something fascinating about how diseases live and die. First factor, nutrition. By the early 1900s, people were eating better. Iron-rich foods became more available and affordable. Fresh vegetables, meat, fortified cereals, the pale, weak girls who would have been diagnosed with green sickness. They weren't pale and weak anymore. Turns out when you feed adolescent girls properly during their growth spurts, when their bodies are demanding iron for menstruation and development, they don't develop that characteristic greenish pallor. The mystery symptom that gave chlorosis its name was probably just iron deficiency all along. Fashion played a huge role too. Those Victorian corsets that squeezed girls into hourglass shapes. They were literally crushing internal organs, making it hard to breathe, hard to move, hard to be healthy. By the 1910s and 1920s, women's clothing was loosening up. Drop-waist dresses, no more tight lacing. Suddenly girls could take deep breaths without wheezing. They could move their arms freely. Blood could actually circulate properly. Half the symptoms of chlorosis disappeared when women stopped wearing torture devices, disguised as undergarments. Then there's exercise. Victorian girls were kept indoors like hothouse flowers, too delicate for physical activity, too fragile for sunshine. By the 1920s, women were riding bicycles, playing tennis, swimming. The new woman was active, outdoors, building actual muscle instead of cultivating fashionable weakness. Fresh air and movement did what centuries of medical treatments couldn't. Those listless, breathless girls started breathing easier when they were allowed to use their lungs and hearts and muscles like they were designed to be used. But here's the big one. Science was advancing. Doctors were learning to look at blood under microscopes. They could count red blood cells, measure hemoglobin levels. Hematology was becoming a real field. When physicians could actually see what was happening in the blood, they stopped making up theories about stagnant humours and lovesickness. A girl with pale skin and fatigue? Check her iron levels. Give her iron supplements. No marriage required. Medicine was becoming less mystical, more measurable, less about moral judgments, more about actual chemistry. Social expectations were shifting too. The idea that every girl needed to marry as soon as possible, that was fading. Women were entering the workforce, going to college, living independently. The years between puberty and marriage were no longer seen as dangerous territory requiring medical supervision. Adolescence became a normal life stage instead of a disease state. When delayed marriage stopped being scandalous, doctors stopped diagnosing girls with conditions that marriage was supposed to cure. The social problem disappeared, so did the medical solution. This is where it gets really interesting. The same symptoms that doctors had called chlorosis for centuries were suddenly being diagnosed as simple anemia. Same pale skin, same fatigue, same irregular heartbeat. But now it was iron deficiency anemia, treated with dietary changes and supplements. The symptoms hadn't changed, the social interpretation had. Medicine was learning to separate real physiological problems from cultural anxieties about women's behaviour. Sometimes a tired teenage girl is just a tired teenage girl who needs more iron. What's fascinating is how quickly the transition happened. Medical textbooks from 1915 still included chapters on chlorosis treatment. By 1925, those chapters were gone. Doctors who had spent careers diagnosing the disease of virgins suddenly stopped seeing it. It wasn't that women stopped getting anemia. They kept getting anemia. But anemia was now a blood disorder requiring iron, not a sexual disorder requiring marriage. The disease disappeared the moment medicine stopped connecting women's health to their sexual status. Pretty convenient timing, right? The disappearance reveals something crucial about how diseases work. Chlorosis served social purposes that had nothing to do with health. It pressured girls to marry young. It pathologized resistance to marriage. It gave families medical justification for controlling daughters' choices. When those social purposes were no longer needed, when women could delay marriage without scandal, when female independence became acceptable, the disease lost its usefulness. Medicine stopped providing the diagnosis because society stopped demanding it. The construction crumbled when its foundation shifted. By the 1930s, chlorosis was medical history. Doctors looked back on it like we look back on bloodletting, an embarrassing mistake from less enlightened times. But here's the thing, those earlier doctors weren't stupid. They were working within belief systems that made sense in their context. They genuinely thought they were helping young women. The tragedy is how many girls were rushed into unwanted marriages, subjected to useless treatments, told their normal adolescent experiences were pathological, all in the name of medicine that was actually enforcing social control. The Vanishing of Chlorosis teaches us to be suspicious of medical diagnoses that seem to target specific groups for behavior that threatens social norms. When medicine aligns too neatly with what society wants to control, we should ask hard questions. Are we treating actual illness or policing deviation from expected roles? The ghost of green sickness reminds us, some diseases disappear not because we cure them, but because we stop needing them. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the most radical act is recognizing which illnesses never existed at all. The social construction of diseases. Here's something that will mess with your head. Diseases aren't always what they seem. Take chlorosis. For 400 years, it was one of the most common diagnoses for young women. Every medical textbook had a chapter on it. Hospitals filled beds with chlorosis patients. Then suddenly, around 1920, it just vanished. Not gradually, not because we found a cure. It literally disappeared from medical practice overnight. Same symptoms that doctors had been treating for centuries. They started calling them something else entirely. Think about that for a second. How does a disease that affected millions of women for 4 centuries just stop existing? The answer cuts to the heart of how medicine actually works. Because diseases aren't just biological facts sitting out there waiting to be discovered. They're partly constructed, shaped by the societies that name them, categorize them, decide what counts as normal versus pathological. The same symptoms can be a disease in one era, normal variation in another. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory. It's how medical knowledge has always worked. Doctors don't just observe symptoms, they interpret them through frameworks shaped by their culture, their training, their assumptions about how bodies should function. When those frameworks change, the diseases change too. Green sickness disappeared when society stopped viewing unmarried adolescent girls as inherently pathological. The symptoms didn't vanish, the interpretation did. Same bodies, different story. Here's where it gets really dark. Medical diagnoses carry enormous power. They can justify control, enforce social norms, pathologize resistance. A girl who didn't want to marry wasn't expressing preference. She had green sickness. Her reluctance became a symptom. Her family could pressure her into marriage for her own health. Medical authority gave social control a scientific veneer. The diagnosis wasn't just describing reality, it was creating it. The cure always revealed the real agenda. Marriage and pregnancy for green sickness. Horseback riding to simulate intercourse if marriage wasn't possible. Vaginal pessaries to stimulate the womb. These weren't treatments for a biological condition. They were prescriptions for social conformity. The medical establishment wasn't just treating sick women, it was producing compliant ones. Diagnosis became a tool of domestication, science in service of patriarchal control. When chlorosis vanished in the 1920s, it proved the diagnosis had been cultural construction all along. Better nutrition reduced actual anemia. Looser clothing and outdoor activities improved women's health. But most importantly, society stopped pathologizing delayed marriage. Women could be single and healthy simultaneously. The medical emergency of unmarried adolescence evaporated because the social emergency did. No more disease because no more social problem requiring medical solution. Don't think this ended with green sickness. The pattern continues today. What we consider mental illness, behavioral disorders, even normal variations, all shaped by cultural expectations. When homosexuality was classified as mental disorder, the cure was conversion therapy. When it was declassified in 1973, same behaviours stopped being pathological overnight. Same pattern, different era. Medical categories rise and fall with social attitudes. Science follows culture more often than we'd like to admit. This doesn't mean all diseases are fake, or that medicine is just opinion. Broken bones are broken bones. Cancer is cancer. But the grey areas, the conditions that blur lines between normal and abnormal, healthy and sick, those reveal how much cultural interpretation shapes medical practice. We decide what deserves treatment, what counts as suffering, what behaviours need fixing. Those decisions aren't purely scientific. They're deeply, fundamentally social. The human cost was real. Women rushed into unwanted marriages because doctors said they'd die otherwise. Girls subjected to invasive treatments for the crime of not wanting husbands yet. Adolescent moodiness transformed into medical emergency, requiring sexual submission. These weren't abstract theoretical discussions. They were real women's lives shaped by diagnoses that served everyone except the patients themselves. Medical authority can be a form of violence, even with good intentions. So, what questions should we be asking today? When someone's distress gets medicalized versus normalized, who benefits? When new disorders appear in diagnostic manuals, what social work are they performing? When treatments focus on changing the patient rather than their circumstances, what assumptions are we making? Medical objectivity is partly myth. Acknowledging that doesn't discredit medicine, it makes it more honest about its limits and biases. As you settle into sleep, remember that medical knowledge isn't handed down from on high. It's constructed by human beings working within particular historical moments with specific cultural blind spots. The same symptoms that made you sick in one era might be perfectly normal in another. Understanding this doesn't make you anti-science. It makes you a more critical consumer of medical authority. Sleep well knowing that your body belongs to you, not to the social expectations disguised as medical necessity. A legacy of transformation. Here's what gets me about this whole Chlorosis story. 400 years, 4 centuries of telling teenage girls their bodies were broken if they weren't married yet. Millions of women diagnosed with a disease that wasn't real. And then 1920s roll around and it just vanishes. Poof, gone, like it never existed. That's not how real diseases work, right? Tuberculosis didn't just decide to take a century off. Smallpox didn't politely excuse itself from medical textbooks because fashion changed. Think about what actually happened here. Doctors stopped looking for green sickness because society stopped needing it. Women were getting more education, working outside the home, marrying later, and suddenly nobody needed a medical excuse to rush them to the altar. The symptoms didn't disappear. The interpretation changed. That pale, tired teenage girl in 1880, green sickness, needs a husband. Same girl in 1920, maybe anemia, give her some iron pills. Different lens, different disease, but let's be real about what this cost. All those young women who were told their melancholy meant they were sick, who got married at 15 because a doctor said that was the cure, who spent their teenage years being examined by physicians who insisted their unmarried state was literally poisoning their blood. Some of them probably were anemic, some were probably just teenagers being teenagers. Moody, uncertain, figuring things out. We turned normal adolescence into a medical emergency. The scariest part? How respectable it all was. These weren't fringe doctors or backwards quacks. Harvard Medical School taught this. Oxford professors wrote about it. Shakespeare put green sickness jokes in his plays because everyone knew what it meant. The entire medical establishment agreed. Unmarried teenage girls were fundamentally unhealthy. It wasn't controversial. It was just obvious. To everyone. For centuries. Until it wasn't. That should make us all a little nervous about what seems obvious now. What saved these women wasn't better doctors. It was better options. When women could work, could stay in school longer, could choose when and if to marry, Suddenly being unmarried at 18 wasn't a medical crisis. It was just life. The disease evaporated because the social pressure that created it relaxed. Medicine followed culture, not the other way around. Those Victorian girls weren't sicker than modern teenagers. They were just living in a world that needed them to be sick. Here's what we learned from this vanishing act. Diseases aren't just biology. They're stories we tell about bodies, about what's normal, about who deserves concern and who deserves control. Green sickness was never about pale skin or strange cravings. It was about keeping women on a specific timeline. Puberty, marriage, pregnancy, repeat. Any deviation from that script became pathology. Any delay became dangerous. The diagnosis enforced the timeline. Medicine became the enforcer of social expectations. And it worked. For centuries it worked perfectly. Parents rushed their daughters to doctors who confirmed their worst fears. Yes, she's sick. Yes, it's because she's not married. Yes, you need to find her a husband immediately. The girl's own feelings about marriage became irrelevant. She wasn't refusing because she had preferences. She was refusing because she was ill. Her resistance proved her diagnosis. It was brilliantly circular logic, completely unfalsifiable, and completely cruel. But something beautiful happened in the wreckage of this fake disease. As chlorosis disappeared, space opened up. Space for girls to be awkward and uncertain without being labelled sick. Space to figure out their own timing for major life decisions. Space to be teenagers without being medical emergencies. We stopped pathologizing female adolescence. We started seeing it as, well, adolescence. Complicated, sure, sometimes difficult, but normal, not requiring immediate cure through marriage and pregnancy. The ghost of green sickness still haunts us sometimes. Anytime someone suggests women's health problems stem from lifestyle choices that don't match traditional expectations. Anytime female pain gets dismissed as psychological, while male pain gets taken seriously. Anytime normal female experiences get treated as disorders requiring management rather than understanding. The urge to medicalize women's deviation from expected roles didn't disappear with chlorosis. It just got suppler, more sophisticated. What we gained is precious. The right to grow up slowly, to be uncertain about your future without being diagnosed, to experience the normal emotional messiness of adolescence without doctors insisting marriage will fix you, to make your own timeline for major life decisions, to be pale and tired sometimes without it meaning you're failing at femininity. These freedoms are recent. They're fragile. They were won by women who refused to accept that their unmarried bodies were broken. So sleep peacefully, knowing that your adolescence belongs to you, not to doctors who want to diagnose it, not to families who want to rush it, not to societies that want to control it. The teenage years are yours to navigate at your own pace, in your own way. You're allowed to be uncertain, moody, tired, dreamy, all the things that would have gotten you labelled sick just a century ago. That's not pathology, that's just being human. And being human has never required anyone else's permission.